Hi, I'm Dr. Sharon Saline, and welcome to our Friday Facebook Live with Attitude Magazine. This was started initially to support people about living with the pandemic, but it's grown into a community of its own, and I look forward to this for the end of my week, and I love talking to you and meeting you. My name is Dr. Sharon Saline. You can learn more about me at www.drsharonsaline.com. And I'm pleased to announce that I have one or two spaces left in my master class, which is starting on Monday. It's called Stop White Knuckling It, Parenting Neurodiverse Kids in a COVID Winter. It's particularly for parents of kids ages 8 to 14. If you're interested, I think Annie's going to put up the link. Check that out, or you can go to my website and the information is there in the store. Let's get started. Today we're going to talk about how do we discuss ADHD with our kids, with our family members, perhaps at work. I'd like to explore all of these different situations with you, but I'd like to start with something from my own practice. So I'm working with a a uh, a, a 9-year-old girl, and I asked her what ADHD means to her, and this girl said she does not want to have ADHD because she doesn't want to have a disorder. She doesn't think there's something wrong with her brain, and she doesn't like that word, which is what I hear a lot. And so I asked her what she does want, what she does think that ADHD means to her. And this is what she said. I can't show, I guess I could show it to you if you see it. I'd have to put it way up here. I don't know if it really is going to read. I don't think so. But she says, every letter is a different color. And she says, I have active, determined, heavenly dreamer, or I have amazing, desirable, heartwarming, delightful. Isn't that awesome? I love that. Um, Active, determined, heavenly dreamer, amazing, desirable, heartwarming, delightful. That is a great definition of ADHD. So let me say hello to a few more people who have joined. Let's see, Vinita from Princeton. Yes, Julie, it's cold there too, I bet. Kimberly, thanks for joining from Connecticut. Harlan, nice to see you. Kelly, John comes up with our first question. What is the difference between ADHD and autism? This is a great question. You know, both ADHD and autism, as well as learning disabilities, can be neurological or brain-based conditions. And the difference is that for kids with ADHD, they reach all of the developmental markers of social development, conversation, parallel play to engaged play to turn taking. They understand the conventions of social interactions. They may not be able to follow them, but they understand them. For kids who are on the spectrum, they don't understand them. So it's not just a question, as it is for kids with ADHD, of missing the cues, but it's really about not quite getting what it means to look someone in the eye, or what it means when someone shows you that they're crying, how you should respond. And so that's one of the main differences between ADHD and ASD. Of course, there's a significant overlap. Many kids who are diagnosed with ASD as their primary diagnosis, in fact, 50% of those kids have a diagnosis of ADHD. On the inverse, however, only about 14% of kids whose primary diagnosis is ADHD have a diagnosis of ASD. So that's really interesting. So I'd really like to spend this time talking about who you want to describe ADHD to and what you've tried. Okay, so let's see. Greg, nice to see you. Harlan, I love the determined. I know, right? Isn't that so great? I tell my boys they have a superpower, Diana says, just so they just have to learn how to use it or control it. Absolutely. So of course, Ed Hallowell says it's like you have a, Jaguar brain, but bicycle brakes. Hi, Elizabeth, and hey, David. Nice to see you. So my first question to you, and this is what I think will help us go along today, is how do you describe ADHD? In your life? How do you describe it to your friends, to your family? And if you're teaching a child to describe it, what do you say to them? So we know that ADHD is a chronic condition that affects the ability to manage impulses and pay attention in many ways more severely than in people who do not have ADHD, and that the percentages of population varies, of course, depending on the country, but in general, in the United States, about 10% of kids ages 3 to 17 have received a diagnosis of ADHD at some point, and the adult range is a little bit lower, anywhere from 4 to 6%, depending on how you measure. Um, I think maybe that might be, I hope that's correct. So I don't want to mislead, but it is definitely lower in adults. It's actually adults is more like 4.5%. Now I'm correcting myself. And that's a big difference between 10 and 4.5. And it has to do with assessment and and the ways that we understand adult ADHD. So I'd like to know what you call ADHD in your life and why. So Carol says, I have a friend who calls it creativity, flexibility plus, or plus plus in some cases. I love the description. I love that description too. Now, in my office, I try not to use ADHD unless people use that with me first. And I always like to ask, what does that mean to them? I'm interested in what kind of brain a person thinks they have. And so I tend to refer to ADHD as attention wandering for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder inattentive type, and fast brain for ADHD hyperactive impulsive type, and sometimes fast inattentive brain for the combined type. But mostly what I like to do is I like to ask kids what kind of brain do they have? And I give them some examples. Is it a dreamy brain? Is it a foggy brain? Is it a really quick brain? Is it a I move around all the time kind of brain? We want the name of whatever ADHD is called to make sense to them and the type of brain that they have in their bodies. Kimberly says, I describe it as a gift. We need to learn how to channel. I love that. That's beautiful. Jessica says, race car brain and superheater superpowers. I love that. So when we think about ADHD and we think about what we're calling it, what we want to do is to start to remember that language affects our thinking. So how we name it, what we say about it is very important. So let's talk a little bit more about what is ADHD. So when we think about ADHD, we refer to this idea of living with this persistent inattention or hyperactivity or impulsivity that's more severe than typically observed in peers. And the male to female ratio is about 3 to 1. It is the most inherited condition. Over 50% of adults with ADHD have a child with ADHD. Okay, so Kate says, I say to my 7-year-old, yes, you have ADHD, and this just means you find some things a bit more tricky than others, and you have to work a little harder at controlling your feelings. We also call it a superpower. He also has 4 other ailments. I also say, you're just very busy. That's not a bad thing. Life would be full if we were all the same. I love that. And, there was this great book I used to read when my kids were younger, and it was Mr. Plumbean, something something, and Annie, if you can find it. And it's about this man, Mr. Plumbean, who decides one day that he wants his house to look a particular way, and it doesn't look like all the other houses in the neighborhood. And his neighbors come up to him and they say, "Oh, your house doesn't look like all the other houses. It doesn't fit in." And he says, "My house is a reflection of me. My house is where I want to be. This is how I want it, how I love it." And people would come by and he'd serve them lemonade. They hang out on the hammock, and soon all the other houses on the street transformed into a castle or into like a hot air balloon. It's really great. It's an adorable book. And I love this book when we think about ADHD brains, because we all don't have to be the same or do the same thing. And if you know the title of the book, Kathleen, if you could put it in the chat, because my brain is not coming up with the answer. So Harlan says, when I lose track of what someone else is saying, I say, I get so excited about what you are saying that I had a traffic jam in my head. Can you repeat whatever I need to rehear? I love that idea, Harlan, because everybody understands a traffic jam and it's not a pejorative term. That's great. Courtney says, I tell my kids that our brains work differently and medication is like putting glasses on our brains. That's exactly what one of my clients once said. It's like glasses for my brain. I can see without them, but I see much better when I'm wearing them. That's terrific. Um, Kate said, I meant dull, not full of apologies. Yes. Okay. So I want to say a few more things about the facts of ADHD. So 57% of adults with ADHD have at least one child with ADHD. And if you have one child with ADHD, there's a 33% chance you're going to have a second child with ADHD. Now we know, no, it's not Mr. Pine's Purple House. It's definitely Mr. Plumbean. So Kathleen, if you know that, that would be great. Um, I can look it up, but I can't look it up and talk at the same time. Sorry. So we know that ADHD rarely travels alone. About 70% of kids with ADHD have a learning disability. 87% of kids with ADHD have at least one other diagnosis, whether that's a mental health diagnosis or a physical diagnosis, and 67% have two. So people with ADHD have a lot of trouble with self-management. They may get injured. They may be a little bit, as the word I think is clumsy. I don't particularly care for that word. They may be a little more reckless or restless than average. Often parents who are raising kids with ADHD are on high alert. They're trying to anticipate and protect the child. It's the big orange spot. Thank you, Kathleen. Mwah. The Big Orange Splot. I love that book. I am so grateful. Thank you. So check that book out. It's really good. Yes, thank you, Annie. It's the best book. I love this book. I don't even know the author. Um, so we have to, when we're talking about ADHD to other people, we have to know some of these basic facts, because when this is a fact-based time that we live in, people can go online and get all kinds of information. So we want to present the facts that we know about ADHD to other people. So we're educating them about where we come from. That's why when I teach about ADHD, I always say a few things about, the my beliefs and what I know, so that we're all on the same the playing field. One thing that I do want to say about ADHD and autism is that kids with who are on the spectrum are their behaviors are characterized by problems with social interactions, communication, and sometimes repetitive or ritualistic behaviors. I didn't share that before. And I think it's worth noting that historically a greater number of children of color have been diagnosed with ADHD, and even within the range of intellectual disabilities, when they did not have those, that was a way of taking out of the classroom kids who were alternative learners. When a child has both ADHD and ASD, research has actually found the importance of treating the ADHD with medication as a means to successfully intervening with some of the ASD symptoms. So, Kelly says one of my twins has it and the other doesn't. The one who doesn't becomes very frustrated. They are 7. Well, we talked a little bit last week about the challenges of having twins. How do you describe ADHD to both of them, and how do you help the twin who doesn't have it not feel resentful and judgmental of the twin who does, and the reverse? How do you help the child who has ADHD not feel less than or compete with the child who does? It's very, very challenging. Elizabeth says, my son has speech disfluencies and sensory issues. I've always wondered if those went hand in hand with ADHD. It's very interesting that you said 87% of children with ADHD are diagnosed with something else. Yes, and I'll tell you some of the statistics about that. First of all, I want to say something about learning disabilities and ADHD. So, as I said, 70% of people who have ADHD have a learning disability. And this breaks down in the following way: 33 to 45% of kids have reading challenges or dyslexia. Math, 20 to 30%, dyscalculia, and writing, 57 to 65%. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, writing is one of the hardest things to do for people with ADHD because it uses all of your executive functioning skills, many of which are challenged. 10% of kids with learning disabilities are diagnosed with ASD, and the more severe the executive functioning challenge, the higher the likelihood there is of a learning disability. So again, I'd like to ask you another question. I'd like you to tell me, what are some of the challenges you face in talking about ADHD with other people? I'd love to hear some questions and some comments. I think that'd be a great conversation for us to have as we move through some of this information. Courtney, I'm experiencing that I want to talk about my ADHD journey 1 year in, good for you, to my family and friends, but they seem uncomfortable with the topic. They don't ask follow-up questions or give me a blank stare or avoid the topic. Ouch. When you say that, what it sounds to me is like people aren't really paying attention. They're not that interested in the fact that you discovered that you have ADHD. And I'm curious about that because I think for a lot of people that goes into misunderstanding what ADHD is about. And I think there's this sort of myth in our culture, oh, everybody has a little ADHD. It's not that big a deal. Instead of the reality that actually, no, that's not the case. Um, you can have a mild form, you can have a moderate, you can have more severe, different levels of challenges with ADHD. We all have attentional issues, particularly now with media multitasking. But people with ADHD have serious challenges with many of their executive functioning skills that are different than what the challenges neurotypical people face. So let's see. So I'm sorry to hear that. Let's see. Uh, Kate says, I'm on high alert all the time. It's the impulsivity I struggle with my 7-year-old. You're welcome. Elizabeth says, my son has speech difficulties. Yes. So what I wanted to say to you, Elizabeth, is that about 20% of kids diagnosed with ADHD have sensory processing issues as well. Okay. And Courtney, I think that if people, I want to say, if you're talking to people about your journey with ADHD and they're really not asking follow-up questions, you have a couple choices. One is, you can say, I noticed that, you're not asking me anything. Is this a topic you don't really want to discuss? Or, just take that information in and then find your people. There's lots of great ADHD support groups. There's this group right here. There's also a lot of stuff on Facebook, specific ADHD support groups, particularly for women. Kim, my 11-year-old and 9-year-old both have it, but totally opposite manifestations. I just want to say pause. That's very challenging. My 11-year-old girl is dreamy, inattentive, extremely distracted by noise, and my 9-year-old son is loud, never stops talking, and needs constant stimulation. I can only imagine that your two kids are at each other's throats a lot because the one who needs quiet and who processes information probably more slowly is very different and probably interrupted, irritated, etc. by your 9-year-old. Um, and I think it would be important. There are some great children's books, and I know that Attitude has a list of resources, but it might be great to talk about how ADHD can manifest in girls differently than in boys, and it's basically two shoes of the same pair, so to speak, and so that we have to offer respect to both things. So your son has, what would respect look like for your daughter? What's a signal for her when the noise is too loud and she can't process? And what's something that's hard for him? Maybe one of the challenges for him is that he's actually not getting the level of interaction and attention, particularly from her, that he would like. Can you set aside time once a day where she pays attention to him for a limited time and plays cards or does something like that? That might help the need for him to keep pushing at her. My granddaughter seems dyslexic, but not all the time. I'm not a reading specialist, but I can say that, sometimes some texts are more challenging than others. And I think that it's important if you think if your granddaughter may be dyslexic, that you get that evaluated as soon as possible. Um, People saying ADHD is just an excuse. Okay, so, I think that people who say ADHD is just an excuse obviously don't understand it. And my response when people say that to me, whether it's clients or teachers or anybody in the world, when I tell them what I do, I say ADHD is a biologically based condition um, that interferes with neurotransmitters. It is real, it is diagnosable, and it is treatable. Um, and then I don't get into it more than that, but I'm very clear and very firm in my response, as you can tell. Harlan, my niece has one son on the edge of extreme and the other who does not demonstrate anything like this. Sometimes the typical one gets frustrated by the attention the other attracts. He's even said his brother will eventually be in prison. Ouch. It is hard to be the non-ADHD sibling in a family. I've experienced this personally, and I also have sat with many, many families who've lived with this. I think that one of the challenges in situations like that is that the non-ADHD child needs to feel like that they matter and that there's special attention for them because a lot of the family energy goes toward the child managing the child with ADHD. So if you can help her set up some alone time with each child, that would be a step in the right direction. Kim, I have it, my daughter has it, and when I was trying to get my son diagnosed, being told, "You just think everyone has it." Right, I think that's because of the genetic component, and I think that's another thing you can say to people. 50% of adults who have ADHD have at least one child with ADHD, and sometimes two. It's hereditary. It's the most inherited mental health condition by far. The name ADHD, Paula, can give a misunderstanding of what it truly is. I agree. And over the years, the name ADHD has changed. It was ADD, then it was, it's just been different than it was, hyperkinetic child at one point. So I think that that's why it basically say, in my practice, what I like to talk about is attention wandering and fast brain or whatever, because ADHD doesn't always make sense. And plus, there's that disorder thing. Nobody wants to have a disorder. Now, the value of the word disorder is that you can get mandated services. That's important if when you're a student in particular, or you qualify for disability policies at work. That's important. But that's what it's good for. It's not necessarily good for your identity for saying, "Oh, I'm a disabled I have I'm a disordered person." Nah, put that away. You have a different kind of brain. You're a creative out of the box thinker. Think of my little girl whose sign I showed you, right? That's the part we want to hold on to and nurture. Um, People dismiss it as an excuse and that it's overdiagnosed. Well, according to Russell Barkley, it's underdiagnosed, particularly in adults, and it's often misdiagnosed in kids. And that's the thing that I think is worth saying to people is like, well, there are cases where it's misdiagnosed, but actually the research shows that it's underdiagnosed in certain populations, particularly kids of color, who do not receive thorough assessments. Um, so we want to share the facts and the information. ADHD is not an excuse. The awareness of having ADHD is helping you determine a map. So you can know the territory of your brain and where you need to have rest stops and where you need to get some fuel. And you know what I'm talking about. You get the metaphor, right? Kimberly says, many people tell me that my girl needs a spanking and a punishment. So I don't support either of those things. I think that what works with kids with ADHD, in fact, what works with kids today is incentive-based motivation, logical and natural consequences. A natural consequence is if you go outside and it's 12 degrees, like it is today out here, and you don't have gloves, your hands will get cold. A logical consequence is if you um, if you stay up late and I find out that you sneaked your phone because you came in my room to get it. The logical consequence is you will not earn the privilege of having that phone for a period of time until you earn back my trust. And that's how we teach skills because kids with ADHD, adults, need skills. We want to focus on skill instruction. Punishment doesn't teach any skills. Brad, how early is too early to have a diagnosis? I have 2-year, 5-month-old twins. Twin B was diagnosed back in October with ASD, and I am relatively certain that twin A has ADHD. I'm also diagnosed with ADHD. Um, well, I think 2.5 is kind of young. Generally, we start sometime around 4 or 5, but that's up to you and your primary care provider or pediatrician. So I would talk to them about that. The question is, once they have the diagnosis, what does that mean and what are you willing to do? And I think that at that stage, you'd really want to work on cognitive behavioral interventions more than anything else. Elizabeth, I found that other people who are not educated in regards to ADHD are often quick to judge or label kids as bad because they can't control their impulses. I agree. And that also infuriates me. Um, Maybe we should do one of these on things that make us mad about ADHD. I'll come with my long list. Um, you know, what is bad? What is good? Good is meaning you're cooperative, you listen, you're more submissive. Is that what we're talking about here? What is bad? Bad is that you're different than what the typical student is. I just reject those categories out of hand. And so I think that in those instances, we do the world of ADHD a service when we say, actually, they're not bad, they have challenges and they're working on them. We want to reframe whatever negative language comes at us as much as we can. I see Diana's responding to Kim. My sons are 20 and 17. They're the same opposites. Diana, maybe you can share how you managed that. That would probably be helpful to Kim. Nikki, my daughter's in high school. She's very intelligent, but lacks the ability to organize her work or get things in on time or finish things. It's very frustrating. She often falls through the cracks when serving. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I think you meant while when studying. But so one of the problems with 2E kids, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what is 2E, twice exceptional kids? Um, let's talk about that. 2E kids are kids who have been evaluated, who are exceptionally bright, and also have um, other challenges. So these are highly intelligent people with unevenly developed skills, particularly as children and adolescents. There are a number of coexisting conditions with the high intelligence, whether they're physical challenges or in terms of medical issues or other kinds of mental health issues or learning challenges. So what we have is, very high intelligence along with lower performance in certain areas. And these kids are aware of this difference, and it fosters anxiety and a lot of shame and intense frustration. Um, Sometimes their higher intelligence can compensate for some of their executive functioning or challenges or deficits when they're younger. But when they get to a place where they have to demonstrate more organization, as in middle school or high school, they start to stumble because they're developing their challenged executive functioning skills are now having to rise to the occasion, and they're just not there, and so their intelligence can't compensate for those deficits anymore. um, a lot of times people believe that because they're really strong in certain academic areas that they should succeed in all of the areas, and that's a lot of pressure for these kids because there are simultaneous issues that are overlapping. So what I see is a lot of intelligent kids who struggle with s- moderate to severe executive functioning challenges, organization, initiation, prioritizing, planning, goal directed persistence. Um, and they are not getting the support they need because they're too smart. Jody, difficulties explaining to preteen friends ADHD. That's it. So that's a really great this is a great point to make, which is how when you're a preteen, you get a diagnosis, how do you explain this to your friends? And I think that has to do with how she um your daughter, I guess, sees it herself. If she says I'm differently wired, thanks Debbie Reber, or I'm uniquely wired, or my brain just works differently, that's one way to go. Or she could say I have some attention issues, um, I'm working on it. I think that's enough. Like most kids understand, we don't have to go into deep detail with other kids. If she has a close friend that she wants to explain it to, she can. But really, I think that being able to just say, you know what, I found out that I have some trouble paying attention, that my mind drifts, I have a dreamy brain, or, I get foggy sometimes. I may ask you to repeat something. I think that that's really helpful, particularly if she has an ally or two, or if she's in a group conversation, she can turn to that friend and say, hey, I missed that. What was it? When services are offered. Yes, she rejects when services are offered, Nikki. And that has to do with shame. And so I recently had a session with a eighth grader, and he was screaming, raging at his parents because they got an email from the school that in 2 days, when the marking period ended, he was going to be failing English. Now, he gets special services at school, so that enrages me and the parents, that the fact that he gets special services and he's failing English, and they were just told 2 days ago that he was missing assignments from November. That's just not okay. That's a failure of the system. And so, so in those situations, or in this situation, excuse me, with this boy, he was very angry at his parents for contacting the school. When we talked about it, what we talked about was his shame. He was embarrassed. He wanted to be part of the conversation with the teacher. And then when we were able to craft an email together, work out what felt okay to say to the school, he calmed down. Priscilla, I find it difficult to express to others that sometimes I cannot process my emotions quickly. Sometimes I don't look happy right away when I get a gift, and sometimes I'm upset when it takes me a long time to process which exact upset emotion I'm feeling. Um, you know, what I like, I mean, I love what Harlan said is like, there's a little traffic jam in my brain. So, can you give me a minute? Or you can say, you can have a standard kind of response like, thank you so much for X, or this is really interesting, or I like this. Give me a minute to just absorb it and I'll get back to you. You have to find a way to buy yourself some time so you can process it. And what we want to do is to process it, in a way without shame. So what would that look like? Wow, this is a great gift. Give me a minute to take it in. So you're actually, just in the course normalizing in the course of conversation that you need a little time to examine it. Garrett says, spanking and corporal punishment is never the right response or teaching method. Amen. I happen to agree completely. Um, okay, Courtney, I just started my own support group in my town. Woo! Bravo, Courtney. 13 families in one day joined. That's fantastic. I am so happy to hear that. Bravo. And you might want to affiliate with Chad, which is something to consider, because they offer support and they have so many resources. Nicole, people are dismissive because they don't understand how deep the symptoms go. Just because my daughter and I are smart and can appear normal, they think maybe we have anxiety. We do, but ADHD is the big umbrella. That's right. And so people will dismiss what's going on for you because they're like, well, I have anxiety or I have trouble paying attention. We're all the same. And that's just ignorance. And I think in those moments you have to say, you know what? You may not see it, but it goes deep, and just leave it. Don't try to convince someone in a moment when you're feeling hurt or insulted or put down by how they're talking to you. It's not going to come out right. And it's kind of like when our kids provoke us and we react from that aggravated space. We're not going to be our best selves and we're not going to handle it in the way we would like to. Meredith, my 8-year-old daughter was recently diagnosed ADHD and some ODD. Started on low dose meds last month and they are working well. Cool. Understand this is a journey and we are ready to ride the ride and support her, provide her the support she needs. Oh, you're most welcome. It is a journey, and I think that the more that you can see that it's a journey and understand the territory, that map of the territory, it'll help you get from one place to another. And I think it's important while you're planning your trip that you plan to go to one place at a time because people can only work on or change one thing at a time. Jessica says, my son has been released from his behavior therapy because he was burned out and not improving. I didn't know how to discuss that he needed a hands-on approach. He's mild ASD and ODD. I worry about his anger because he still shuts down. I don't know how to explain to my husband that he's just needing a few minutes, like 30. So what I would do is I would try to implement, and I talk about this in my book, What Your ADHD Child Wishes You Knew, a stop, think, act plan, which means you call pause in the action when anybody's distressed for a particular period of time. You set aside what are acceptable activities to do to calm down. You come back together to think about, you know, what was going on and how we're going to move forward. It's a quick summary. It's not a time to teach skills, and then you move on to the next right piece of action. That would be useful probably for everyone in the family. And I would encourage your husband to read or listen to some material, whether it's on attitude, or I have a lot of stuff on my website that or my YouTube channel that doesn't take a lot of time to watch, where you can understand a little bit about the ASD or ODD overlap. There's some great resources on attitude, so check those out. Vanita, Any teleseries you could recommend based on ADHD? I think ASD has more media exposure as compared to ADHD and ADD. Yes, I think that's true. I actually cannot think of a television series in this moment. Um, but if I do, I will say it. I need to think about that for a minute. Modeling what I'm talking about. Jessica Page. Hubby has ADHD. I do, and so far, two of our children do. We all experience ADHD differently, so finding tools for each of us is challenging but worth it. So thank you, Jessica. In this situation, what I would recommend is that the issue isn't that you're all doing the same thing all at once, but there's a process of working on executive functioning systems that's similar and parallel for all of you. So we're all working on our skill. This is how we're working on it. And maybe we're going to come back together in a family meeting once a week and talk about how our particular skill is going. Kate, I find the webinars I've attended about ADHD really inspiring when adults with ADHD say once they have found something in life, work, education, or leisure activities they are fascinated with, they're absolutely fly at it and often feel they are succeeding for the first time in their in ages. It's nice to hear the positives as well as all the understandable struggles. Amen. I love that. I mean, I think it's really important that we all notice and acknowledge our successes as much as possible, and it is important to find that passion, okay? That thing, those things that light you up, because that's where the ADHD brain gets and stays engaged. And particularly if your work isn't that, then it's good to have a hobby or two where you really, get that need filled and nurtured. Hi, Lynn. Nice to have you join us. Courtney, my kids are the same way. My daughter and myself would never have been diagnosed if it wasn't for my son getting diagnosed first because he was so obviously ADHD. Okay. Thanks, Annie. Paula, very tricky and sad when your child is constantly isolating and judged by other parents because they have a lot of energy and are impulsive, even if they are a great friend. How to deal with the mistreatment of your CV old so they can be accepted to see their friends outside of school. Friends love them and the friendship is great. Um, this might be a really great topic to talk about, which is this is just a really important topic. Um, Other parents and their judgment or problems with your child with ADHD. This is a huge topic. I think it's challenging because they don't necessarily know how to deal with your child. They may not be patient with your child, and in fact, being with them may make your child feel bad about themselves. So while this isn't ideal, for you, I think that the weight of play dates and activities with other kids has to be at your house under your supervision. Because if the kids like them, then that's what matters. And I think in some ways, the parents are isolating or judging them because they don't have the skills or the tools to manage to manage your child or other kids with ADHD effectively or sufficiently. So, try to create a play date or an activity where either you and the other parent are participating or you have the kids on your own, at least to build some kind of rapport and regularity. Harlan, yes, my sister tries to remind my niece that she has the other son by always purposefully asking about him in person, first in person or social media. Okay. Um, Diana, we tried medication with my oldest when he was 12, now 20, and he lost 30 pounds. We tried 4 different kinds of medications and ended up deciding not to take medication, but rather better understand his strengths and weaknesses. He finished 7th grade and started homeschool, graduated 10th grade. That's fantastic. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing. And now he's went to preaching school and is in college. Fantastic. Um, Kate says anyone who says ADHD doesn't exist needs to try and live with someone who has it. It is undeniable and very obvious once you have that light bulb of researching it or having a diagnosis. Yes, it's hard, but it's hereditary. It's manageable, and there are positives in all situations and disorders. Agreed, agreed. Jessica, the majority of my family has it. We just naturally seem to end up finding other families that have it. That's great. So you don't have to worry about that judgment. So it's wonderful to know they understand your child and are not judging your child. And that's a good point for the woman who said that for Paula was saying that to try to befriend other kids who are uniquely wired, so that who also may have some social challenges, because that's not maybe where your child feels comfortable, but those parents are more likely to feel comfortable with your child. You're so welcome, Jennifer. Okay, Harlan, I find it difficult to get my adult coach clients to get the accommodations they need when they really, really need them, especially in college and industry standard testing certifications. Yes. So I think that's actually true because I think people believe you outgrow ADHD when really, not that many, like a low percentage, anywhere from 5 to 10% of people outgrow ADHD. And there's some question, our Dr. Ari Tuckman and I have talked about whether people outgrow it, or if the measures to assess adult ADHD are weaker, or they've just accommodated enough. So, those are all questions. And I think that it is important to assist these clients, and it might mean to be online with them while they're on the phone, so you can type them notes about what to say, or have a three-way meeting with a college counselor. Um, you know, uh, um, I think that people are entitled to accommodations. Um, it doesn't mean it's easy, but I really hear what you're saying. Um, Helene says, it was challenging during elementary and high school years to have a beautiful, super talented, artistic child. She was resented and harassed by peers with no mercy, and sometimes by the teachers. She knew more than the teachers. Helene, that breaks my heart. Um, what is she doing now, and how is she? I hope that she's been able to move beyond that. Um, okay, my son was diagnosed with ADHD 2 years ago. Going through the diagnosis process makes me think I have it. That's very common. 40 years ago, it wasn't really heard of much, so I slipped under the radar. I struggle a lot, but hide it. Women often, have, flew under the radar because the kids who got attention for ADHD were the people who were hyperactive or impulsive, which more often is boys. Um, so it's possible that you can have it. There's some great books out there on women with ADHD and great articles on this website that could help you determine um, what's going on. And I would encourage you to try to get assessed by your primary care doctor or by a psychologist or psychiatrist or prescriber. We're going to take a couple more. Jessica, look online for Chew Jewelry. Okay. By far, she knew more than the music teachers in PE. She was also a gymnast. Okay. The roadmap you speak of is in hieroglyphics, and there seems to be no legend. I'm just frustrated. Okay. So thank you for saying this, Garrett. So you're saying that that the roadmap is all jumbled, right? It's hard to see a roadmap. So what I would encourage you to do, if you have had some psych testing, is meet with someone who can actually explain it to you, because I find that a lot of people do the testing and they meet once with people to give them the results. And actually what you need are 3 or 4 meetings to go over the results, what that means to you, what of those challenges are something you want to start with, because you can be overwhelmed. And I think if there are hieroglyphics, um, pick one set of hieroglyphics and let's try to decode those. Just one thing. Okay, narrow the focus to one thing. That way it'll close your field of vision and it'll help your processing. Yes, the misconception that you can't have ADHD if you're smart is very tricky, and we all have to stand up against that. Okay, thank you, Thank you, Paula and Courtney and Helene and Kim and Vanita and Susan. ADHD inattentive, not hyper on the outside anyway, but quiet. Don't fit in, but I cannot find much information about how to figure this out. I think Annie can post something about that, and you'd want to check that out on the website. You also might want to check out some books about women with ADHD. There are a couple great ones. Um, Sari Solden, Linda Rogley, Kathleen Nadeau, and Patricia Quinn, and Ellen Littman. These are all experts in women with ADHD. Uh, Jessica says, I remember teachers saying she can't have ADHD, she's not a problem child. And then I'm going to close with Annalise. Thanks for joining today. I was 2E. I had undiagnosed ADHD and tested near genius range for intelligence. It made things worse for me as the expectations were higher from everyone. So I see that there's a lot of interest and info on 2E and the TUI profile. And I'm wondering if perhaps next week that's something that we'll talk about. Um, so I'll discuss this with Annie at Attitude Magazine. I want to thank all of you, Jessica and Erica. Thank you for sharing. I'm sorry I can't get to everybody, but please come back next week and I will do my best. Again, I'm Dr. Sharon Saline, and this is the weekly Facebook Live for Attitude Magazine. Please follow me on Facebook at Dr. Sharon Saline and check out my website for all kinds of free resources and my YouTube channel. Website is www.drsharonsaline.com. And think about joining me for my masterclass that starts on Monday. Stop white knuckling it, parenting neurodiverse kids in a COVID winter. Have a great weekend. Take care. Stay healthy. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.